Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to start with a new topic and we'll look into T.S. Eliot as a critic. Right? I believe most of you must have read something of his plays or probably his poetry. Well, criticism is more like Eliot's, you know, part of a workshop where he tends to create poetry. All right, so imagine imagine criticism as a place, as a workshop where he has all these tools set for himself, and the end product for him out of all those tools is his poetry. All right, so you see, the poet and the critic go hand in hand where Eliot is concerned. You cannot say the same about the other poet critics like Wordsworth or Coleridge, because for them, criticism is more of a justification for what they wrote as poetry. All right, so a criticism is a byproduct of their poetry, whereas for T.S. Eliot is not a byproduct, but it is the seminal ingredient out of which he creates poetry. All right, you understand the difference? So he is also you could call him the forerunner of modernist writing. Okay, or sort of like he laid the foundation for absurd drama or absurdism, right? So the theater of the absurd or whatever. So, to begin with, T.S. Eliot, as he is famously known, his full name is Thomas Stearns Eliot, who lived from around 1888 to 1965, and he was the pioneer of modern criticism. So, he was a modernist, established modernist. Okay, he describes himself in For Lancelot Andrewes, 1928, as a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, and an Anglo-Catholic in religion. So he is completely, he has this definite idea of who he is, and it is reflected in his works. Of course, there is a deviation at times. No man on earth is completely as he professes himself to be, right? So there are certain deviations, but otherwise he is a firm believer in in terms of classical literature. So he's a firm follower of classical literature, sorry, and also he is completely royalist as far as his political inclinations are concerned, and Anglo-Catholic. Of course, there is a shift in his belief where religion is concerned, because he was raised in a certain way, but he adhered himself to another way entirely. So faith in religion, belief in politics, and concept of literature form one seamless whole in his criticism. So it would be reflected throughout his works, throughout his critical works, and so it's necessary we keep this particular thought in mind, okay, for better interpretation of his work, or better interpretation of his words. All right, so these are some of his key critical works: The Sacred Words, Homage to John Dryden, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, For Lancelot Andrewes, Selected Essays, Elizabethan Essays, Ancient and Modern, and he was also the editor of Quarterly Criterion. Okay, so Quarterly Criterion is quite famous for bringing out quality criticism, quality critical works. As he mentioned earlier, he was a strong follower of classicism, classical literature. So in defense of classical authority as opposed to romantic's individuality, Eliot claims that tradition and the accumulated wisdom of time is essential for objective analysis of a work, which is the prime requirement to see the work as in itself. See, this is something that is echoed around and sort of resonates around the critical field by almost every critic, to see the work as in itself it is, starting from Pope to Arnold to Eliot, every critic wants to see the text, the literature, for what it is, all right, rather than having a biased or half judgment, a partial judgment. Every critic aims to establish the trueness, the completeness of a literary work, all right. So in this case, his belief, or his strong belief, his conviction that one has to adhere to classicism is that he feels that the tradition and the accumulated wisdom of time, see, he believes in tradition. He believes that whatever one is because of his past. He has learned from his forefathers. So a person is the essence of the cumulative experiences of his forefathers, all right. Cumulative experience of his forefathers is in whatever tradition you and I follow, even in everyday life. Whatever practices we have, whatever beliefs we have, whatever tradition we have, they have been time tested. They have come from generations, and hence their durability in the sense, there are things that no matter how modern you become, you will still adhere to, because they are intrinsic, first of all, but at the same time they are a necessary part of our existence, all right. So he feels that classicism has this time tested quality, it has a durability, it has endured through generations, it endured through the centuries, and hence is essential for anyone to have an objective analysis, to provide an objective analysis of work, if any work, all right. So this is what the prime requirement of a critic is, right? So a critic has to be familiar with classical literature, all right. So speaking of critics, he starts off with what true criticism is. True criticism is an actual criticism is. So he is very specific about it, in the sense that he says it's the institution of scientific inquiry, disinterested exercise of intelligence. Though this disinterestedness we've already spoken about, being a disinterested of a critic. Critics need to be disinterested while discussing Matthew Arnold, right? So disinterested does not imply not interested. It means that you are being unprejudiced, not having any special interest, okay. So no personal interest is there, but at the same time you are giving a fair judgment, you are not influenced, right? So disinterested exercise of intelligence. So true criticism is a disinterested exercise of intelligence, as in you apply your intelligence in an unbiased manner. For example, Aristotle's analysis of drama reveals the principle underlying its composition, right? Further, the criticism employed by a trained and skilled writer on his own work is bound to be superior. Unconscious artists make unconscious critics, and there is no better critic of a work than the author himself. So you see, what is true criticism? A true criticism is something that explains or shows the underlying principles that governs a text, okay. For example, Aristotle he wrote on drama, right, as to how what the working conditions of drama are, like what makes a drama click, what it makes complete, wholesome. He as far as I hope you remember Aristotle's lecture, my lecture on Aristotle. He laid the ground rules for the unities and especially tragedy, and he wrote about the integral components of tragedy, what makes up for a tragedy, what kind of hero you ought to have for a successful tragedy, right? Hamartia, peripeteia, anagnorisis, catharsis, cathartic effect of tragedy on the audience, on the reader, right? So this disinterested scientific inquiry of exercise of intelligence is what is true criticism, right? So and also any writer, poet or novelist or whoever it is, who can criticize his own work is bound to create superior criticism. Okay, so so in this regard, you could say any writer, right, as in like Wordsworth, Coleridge, or any writer for that matter, who writes himself, who creates, who is a creator himself, at the same time a critic of his own work, is bound to create superior kind of criticism. Okay, so moving on, historical sense. What is historical sense? As I said earlier, Eliot lays quite a lot of stock by tradition. So to him, tradition is the ultimate, ultimate treasure house of wisdom. Okay, wisdom gained by experience. All right. So T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, that appeared in The Egoist and is considered as the unofficial manifesto of T.S. Eliot's criticism. So in it, Eliot claims that tradition does not mean a blind or timid adherence, but a historical sense. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the past, of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So you see, when we speak of the historical sense, there are two ways of approaching history. Okay, so whenever you read, I mean, we're all used to history classes in school, right? So whatever we are told, we tend to, as children, we tend to blindly agree with anything the textbook tells you. But as we grow up, we actually come to realize that there are many versions of the same history, right? So there would be one sense where where what the history book tells you may be to some extent right. At the same time, there ought to be many other stakeholders who have their own versions of history, and according to those versions are equally right. So Eliot tells you not to completely blindly follow history. Okay, it's not a timid adherence. Timid as if like an obsequious servile adherence, like you just someone who is mentally brainwashed, mentally conditioned to follow something blindly. So remember, all those Hitler's followers, they were humans, but they perpetrated inhuman actions. For what purpose? This timid adherence to ideology. They are mentally conditioned. All these fanatics, all the terrorists who inflict terror upon people, who terrorize innocent people, how come they end up doing such inhuman actions? They must have had their own families. They must have had some sense of being human. How did they end up doing all those horrible things? Because they blindly agree to anything that is being told to them, right? So you need not, the idea here is our psychology, our mental conditioning. We need not mentally or timidly adhere without questioning history. All right, this historical sense here means that it is a perception. Okay, it's a way of looking at things, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. As in, it should be like, for instance, if you take up a work of antiquity. Okay, work of antiquity is a very old text. It should be, when you read it, you should be able to connect to it. You should be able to connect to it in the sense that it should, even though it has this very ancient feel to it, at the same time it should still be relevant today. I mean, most great works are. Like, you can still relate to Portia, you can still relate to Viola, you can still relate to probably Desdemona sometimes, right? One woman wronged, Desdemona, who is beautiful, and her beauty becomes a curse for her. Portia, who believes in judgment, who believes that even a woman is capable of achieving just about anything she puts her mind to. She sets her mind to, right? Or Viola, for that instance, who is thrown to the whims of her destiny, and she finds it. She struggles and finds it. Who tries to survive by sheer wit, right? Even though these works were written some 600-700 years back, they still are relevant today. Okay, there is a pastness of the past. They do belong to 16th century, but at the same time there is a presentness to it. You get my point? This is what he calls historical sense. Okay, the historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. See, this is a wonderful way of putting it. So you see, if you start looking at every action you do, not merely writing, I mean, of course, not all of us are writers, but still, considering whatever we create, whatever we speak, whatever we utter, whatever we make. See, when I write poetry, or if you write poetry, you do not write it in vacuum. The words you choose to put in your poetry, to create the verses of your poetry, those words, those ideas must have had their impetus somewhere in your past. You must have read someone, some great writer, some great poet, some great novelist, right? And that forms the basis for your creativity. So when you are writing, it's not merely your individual talent at play. It is the cumulative efforts of all the generations past that has gone past you, that you've been exposed to, that you've read at school or probably by yourself, and that is what compels you to write what you're writing now. So there is, of course, a certain amount of individual talent required even to put your pen to paper and spout poetry, but at the same time it is necessary for anyone who writes to have a historical sense. Okay, so and when one writes in that manner, you have within you the whole sense of all the histories, all the literature from Europe, from England, or from your own region, all inside you, and that flows out of your pen as poetry, or any literary work for that matter. Okay, so the historical sense is timeless as well as temporal. Timeless as in what this is, beyond the idea of time and space. It moves beyond the idea of time and space. Okay, it is timeless as well as temporal, and both together, right? Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation he reserves not for poet but for poetry alone. So this is something he reserves only for poetry, not for poets. Now, individuality, as I said, see, tradition and individual talent, they both are necessary for creation of good poetry. All right, so but then he accords individuality only 5% of importance, 5% importance probably, and 95% to tradition itself. All right, he rejects the idea of individuality of the poet, because to him, when a poet starts writing, he does not write about himself. At least Eliot believes that when Wordsworth as a person would be an entirely different person excuse me. Wordsworth as a poet would be an entirely different person, whereas Wordsworth himself as a person would be an entirely different species, right? So, when you write, you become a separate entity. Okay, so the idea of individuality of the poet, as he insists that the most valuable parts of work are those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. See, the poets that have long gone, the forefathers, the ancestors, these are the ones that ought to assert the presence in your work. Okay, so you see, a work that is really good ought to show something belonging to your masters as in from whom you have learned the art of creativity. Okay, the progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. Please bear this in mind. A continual extinction of personality would imply a continual extinction of personality. Extinction as in your personality ought to recede to the background. It should fade away. When you write, you ought to write as someone else completely. The writing should be of prominence, not the writer. When you read something, the writer should not be visible in it, right? The persona of the writer ought to recede to the background. That's a kind of, it shows a certain progress of the artist. Okay, because here he has to sacrifice himself. He has to become extinct. His personality ought to become extinct. So the mind of Europe, he claims, is more important than the individual poet. Mind of the Europe is more important than the individual poet, in the sense it is the cumulative mind of an entire country. The literatures of the past, literatures of the region, or the literatures that you've been exposed to, that is what is more important than the individual writer, individual poet himself. Okay, so when a poet creates, he does not create his individual persona. He creates the entire background of literature he's been exposed to in his poetry. Okay, so depersonalization. What is depersonalization? Of course, using the analogy of a chemical reaction, Eliot elucidates the process of depersonalization. So a piece of platinum introduced into a gas chamber containing sulfur and carbon dioxide results in a sulfurous acid, while platinum itself remains unchanged. So here, the mind of the poet, imagine the mind of the poet is platinum, and the emotions and feelings, sulfur and carbon dioxide. The perfect poet is less involved. So even though there is the presence of emotions, there is the presence of feelings, and this coupled with all the experiences you've had, you end up producing poetry. Your mind remains aloof. It stays apart. Your persona stays apart. Your personality does not get involved within it. All right, so what happens? A perfect poet is the one who is the least involved, who is the least visible in his poetry. So that's the idea of depersonalization according to T.S. Eliot. Okay, so Eliot maintains that the mind that suffers is different from the man that creates. So the mind that feels, the things that feels, have to be kept separate, and the man that creates. So see, even look at the elegies. I cannot think of a better example. Look at the elegies. Elegies are supposed to be what? Heartfelt grief expressed for the passing of a loved one, right? Or some famous person, right? It ought to be raw. As far as I can understand, elegy is supposed to be really raw. It should come from your heart. It should come from the depths of your heart. The emotion should be completely, leave you gasping for air. That's the kind of emotion that is required for creating elegy. But look at the most popular of elegies. Elegy written in the country churchyard, or Michael, or even, what was that? Lilac in the last, what's that? Dooryard bloomed, right? So when you look at any of these elegies, don't you find a certain superficiality to it? Lycidas, for that matter. Yeah, Lycidas, of course. Don't you think the flowery language, the use of phrases that tend to exert a certain amount of superfluousness to it, don't you think it's completely at odds with what the emotion is supposed to convey, what is supposed to make you feel? Oh, now consider this Dylan Thomas, Death by Water. Now, even though it professes to not be an elegy, it still fulfills the necessity of grief, the necessity of expressing grief for the death of a child. Right? See, what happens is, when the mind that suffers, it completely, and the man that creates. So it's the same person. It's the poet himself, whose mind is suffering. At the same time, it is his talent that is creating poetry. When these two are in sync with each other, they tend to create a very entirely different kind of poetry. But then the mind ought to suffer in its own place, and the talent that the poet has, that is at work, that creates poetry. It will create a kind of poetry that leaves that would be able to channel the emotion, channel the grief, or where elegy is the case. In the case of elegy, channel the grief that is felt by the mind through its writing, through his talent. Right? So for him, he feels that these two are two very separate things. Okay, even though the poet feels, the poet writes, he ought not be visible. He should not be visible in his poetry. It should simply be the transference of those emotions through his talent. All right. Romantic theory of self-expression. Well, we've already discussed about the romanticism. Romanticism itself deals with the idea of individuality, of self-expression. The romantic poets believed in mainly in self-expression, right? To them, that man was the center stage, man was the center of all creation. So anything you write about your own self. That was the idea projected by the romantic writers, right? The experiences which are important to the poet as a man do not have much of a place in his poetry, and those that are quite important in poetry have practically nothing to do with poet's personality. Hence it says, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. So see, what you write in poetry has nothing to do with emotion, and what you so see, first of all, what you have in emotion, okay, whatever the poet feels as a man, whatever the poet thinks is important for him as a man. At least T.S. Eliot feels that it has nothing to do with poetry, nothing to do with what he writes in his poetry. And what is important for poetry, that has practically nothing to do with the poet's personality. Well, this is at odds, complete odds with the romantic idea of criticism. As I said earlier, for the last slide, as I mentioned earlier, that man suffers, the man's thoughts, the poet's thoughts, the poet's thoughts and the poet's talent, when they go hand in hand, they create a certain kind of poetry. And when the thought the suffering is kept aloof, kept separate in a separate chamber, and it is channeled through the talent of the poet. You know, there is a certain objectivity to to the writing itself. So these two different kinds of approaches could be, in my opinion, summed up as the former belonging to the romantic school of writing, and the latter to Eliot school of writing, Eliot or Victorian school of writing. Okay, this is what happens. This is what, this is a major difference as far as the romantics and the Victorians are concerned, or even the neoclassical writings are concerned. Neoclassicism is very much similar to, or probably not similar, but is very close to Victorian writing, rather than the romantic writing. Okay, so poetry is not a turning loser. It's now this is an echo of what Wordsworth says, emotions reflected in tranquility. Remember, what is to him poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions reflected in tranquility, right? So using that phrase, or in view of that phrase, try to understand this line. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So here he is speaking of depersonalization. To him, depersonalization is, what is depersonalization? To remove oneself, okay, to remove oneself from the feeling. Feeling and the creative output. Okay, creative output in the sense you need to remove yourself from your creativity, from your poetry. You ought to write as a separate individual, now not as a person who thinks and feels. Of course it is necessary for thinking and feeling, it is essential, but at the same time you ought to channel it in such a way that you are not seen in it. Okay, it's not an expression of yourself, but it's not an expression of yourself, but an escape from yourself, an escape from personality. So you see, the romantics firmly believed that any writing, for that matter, is an expression of one's individuality, one's personality. Now, T.S. Eliot's argument is completely at odds with what the romantics viewed as essential ingredient for writing. He believes that it is necessary that you remove yourself from your creative output. Okay, therefore, due to this psychical distance, not physical but psychical distance, he is sometimes accused of having an anti-poetic coldness. Anti-poetic coldness as in, a poet ought to feel, think, he ought to write from the depths of the heart. So that's what's been sort of a standard standard motto, or probably a standard what you can call it, a go-to phrase necessary to imagine a poet at work, right? So this is something that we have believed for ages, that a poet ought to feel and write from the depths of his heart. Now here T.S. Eliot is sort of going against the grain and telling you that a poet ought to distance himself from his art. He is completely supposed to remove himself from his art. So that's his idea or opinion on the romantic theory of self-expression. So what is the function of criticism? Okay, I guess I'll stop here. Inshallah, we'll try to continue in the next class. Okay, thank you so much for your patient listening. Assalamu alaikum.